Today on Real Estate Backstage, the TCPA rule changes are put on hold. The White House Office of Management and Budget releases a memo that causes mass confusion. The Federal Reserve has decided to hold rates steady. And Keller Williams files a lawsuit against InsideRE over trademark infringement. All that and more today on Real Estate Backstage. Now, before we jump into today's conversation, if you're watching this on YouTube or if you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, make sure to subscribe to the show that way you don't miss any future episodes. And if you're looking for the show notes where you can find articles that we reference in today's episode, you can find that at realestatebackstage.com/episode 16. Now, we're going to start with the TCPA rule changes. So last month on episode 10 of the show, we did a deep dive into some of the existing rules with the TCPA, which is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, along with some of the important changes that were scheduled to go into effect on January 27th. So this is according to Real Estate News. Quote, on January 24th, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit decided that the Federal Communications Commission's, quote, exceeded its statutory authority with its new one-to-one consent requirement and set it aside. After the ruling, the FCC announced that it was delaying the rule change to next January. The exact timing depends on what happens with the court case, which was filed by the Insurance Marketing Coalition, the IMC, in December of 2023. The rule, which would have been part of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, TCPA, would have amended the TCPA's policy on having prior express consent to include prior express written consent, closing a lead generator loophole where a single consent signature could result in contacts from multiple callers. For real estate professionals, nothing changes for now when it comes to reaching out to potential clients, meaning brokerages won't need to implement new policies just yet, but they need to remain vigilant about following the existing rules. The Court of Appeals ruling noted that a written agreement is still needed and must, quote, include a clear and conspicuous disclosure informing the signing party that they are consenting to telemarketing or advertising, robocalls, and robotexts. Some firms have continued to get into hot water over TCPA violations. For example, Keller Williams was hit with a new telemarketing class action lawsuit last year after reaching a $40 million settlement in a related case in 2023, unquote. So TCPA violations, TCPA lawsuits were up about 40% last year from 2023 to 2024. So even with the new changes being delayed, we need to make sure that we understand and are following all of the existing rules with the TCPA. This includes the do not call list, for example, making sure that you're not calling someone who is registered on that national do not call registry unless you have specific consent from them to do so. Other parts of the TCPA include not calling people before 8 a.m. or after 9 p.m. in their specific time zone. It is incredibly, incredibly important that we follow the existing rules. Again, even though the changes are being delayed, there are a lot of existing rules on the books that a lot of people don't necessarily follow. If you are a Follow a Boss user, if you use FUB for your CRM, I highly, highly recommend you check out this new product called InsideRE. This is a software that integrates with Follow a Boss. I believe there may be one other CRM that they have an integration set up with so far. But essentially what they do is they scrub all of the phone numbers in your database against the do not call list. They'll do an initial screening of your database. They will screen any new leads as they're entered into the system. And they will also double check every 30 days to make sure any of those phone numbers haven't been added to the do not call list during the last month in order to help you guys be compliant. This is a great product. We've been using it for about a month now, and we've been super happy. If you guys are interested, you can go to easyverify.ai. There's a discount code you can use, easyverify20. That gets you 20% off the initial scan. And I don't get paid for saying that. It's just a great product, and I highly recommend you guys check it out. All right, so I'm sure you guys have heard about this over the last week. The OMB, the White House Office of Management and Budget, released a memo that caused a whole lot of confusion, a lot of consternation, speculation. Essentially, it was a temporary pause to certain types of federal spending, particularly grants, loans, and assistance programs. There's a lot of misinformation online, people saying that you weren't going to be able to get a VA loan or an FHA loan, different things like that. Section 8 payments weren't going to be going out. I've got the actual memo here that I'm going to put up on the screen if you're watching on YouTube, and I've highlighted the portions that I think are relevant. So this was Monday, January 27th, and this came from the acting director of the OMB. Here's what it says. Quote, the American people elected Donald J. Trump to be president of the United States, and gave him a mandate to increase the impact of every federal taxpayer dollar. In fiscal year 2024, of the nearly $10 trillion that the federal government spent, more than $3 trillion was federal financial assistance, such as grants and loans. Career and political appointees in the executive branch have a duty to align federal spending and action with the will of the American people as expressed through presidential priorities. Financial assistance should be dedicated to advancing administration priorities, focusing taxpayer dollars to advance a stronger and safer America, eliminating the financial burden of inflation for citizens, unleashing American energy and manufacturing, ending wokeness and the weaponization of government, promoting efficiency in government, and making America healthy again. The use of federal resources to advance Marxist equity, transgenderism, and Green New Deal social engineering policies is a waste of taxpayer dollars that does not improve the day-to-day lives of those we serve. This memorandum requires federal agencies to identify and review all federal financial assistance programs and supporting activities consistent with the president's policies and requirements. And there's a couple footnotes there. So the first thing that says, nothing in this memo should be construed to impact Medicare or Social Security benefits. Moving on to the next page. Quote, to implement these orders, each agency must complete a comprehensive analysis of all of their federal financial assistance programs to identify programs, projects, and activities that may be implicated by any of the president's executive orders. In the interim, to the extent permissible under applicable law, federal agencies must temporarily pause all activities related to obligation or disbursement of all federal financial assistance and other relevant agency activities that may be implicated by the executive orders, including but not limited to financial assistance for foreign aid, non-government organizations, DEI, woke gender ideology, and the Green New Deal. This temporary pause will provide the administration time to review agency programs and determine the best use of the funding for those programs consistent with the law and the president's priorities. The temporary pause will become effective on January 28th, 2025 at 5 p.m. OMB may grant exceptions allowing federal agencies to issue new awards or take other actions on a case-by-case basis. To the extent required by law, federal agencies may continue taking certain administrative actions, such as closeout of federal awards or recording obligations expressly required by law. So this memo specifically referenced a handful of executive orders that President Trump signed the prior week. For example, protecting the American people against invasion, reevaluating and realigning United States foreign aid, putting America first in international environmental agreements. So the purpose of this memo was to say, you guys need to temporarily pause any federal assistance spending that does not fit within the spirit of these executive orders that the president has put out. And again, it specifically excluded any assistance payments made directly to individuals. It specifically said this is not going to impact Medicare or Social Security. And it mentioned a couple times that this needs to be based on any activities that could be implicated by any of the president's executive orders. Now, of course, when this came out, everybody panicked. People were saying that this was a total and complete freeze of all federal spending, which of course was not true. The president does not have the power to do that. Famously, the Congress of the United States holds what's called the power of the purse. The Congress allocates money, they pass the budget, and under the Constitution, the president is required to faithfully execute the law. So if Congress allocates money to something, the president does have to spend that money. Now, there are some slight exceptions in what we call impoundment and control, where the president does have a little bit of discretion, and certain spending can be delayed or paused. The Supreme Court has not really ruled on how extensive the president's authority is to delay or fail to spend money allocated by Congress. It would be interesting to see this go to the Supreme Court and see exactly how much authority the executive branch has in that area. But, of course, the way the Constitution was framed, the legislative branch does have the power of the purse. They get to set the budget and allocate funds, and the president is supposed to faithfully execute that and spend that money in accordance with the law. However, a lot of these federal assistance programs are not specifically things that were obligations that were created by acts of Congress. So the president does have some authority to direct federal funds. All right, and then the next day, they put out a clarification memo because there was so much confusion about what exactly was going to be impacted by this. So here's the the clarification memo that was released the next day on Tuesday the 28th. And again, here's the highlighted portion. Any program not implicated by the president's executive orders is not subject to the pause. The executive orders listed in the guidance are, and then you see the handful of executive orders listed there that President Trump had previously signed prior to this memo from the OMB. So again, this just makes it clear that this is not a total and complete freeze of all federal assistance spending. This is just saying that we want the federal agencies to make sure their discretionary spending is in line with the priorities of the president as outlined in these executive orders. And then there's some Q&A here as well. So for example, is this a freeze on all federal financial assistance? No, the pause does not apply across the board. It is expressly limited to programs, projects, and activities implicated by the president's executive orders, such as ending DEI, the Green New Deal, etc. Question, is this a freeze on benefits to Americans like SNAP or student loans? The answer is no. Any program that provides direct benefits to Americans is explicitly excluded from the pause. Is the pause a federal financial assistance in impoundment? No, it is not an impoundment under the Impoundment Control Act. It is a temporary pause to give agencies time to ensure that the financial assistance conforms to the policies set out in the president's executive orders. And then lastly, why was the pause necessary? To act as faithful stewards of taxpayer money, the new administration must review federal programs to ensure they are being executed in accordance with the law and the new president's policies. All right, so there was still a lot of confusion even after this clarification memo, and a judge actually ruled that the funding pause had to be pushed to Monday, February 3rd. Originally, this was scheduled to go into effect at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, January 28th. A judge said we need to give people more time to actually review and implement, and that was pushed back to Monday, February 3rd. However, the next day, on Wednesday, the White House did issue a rescission of the memo, not necessarily a rescission of the funding pause. So according to White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, quote, this is not a rescission of the federal funding freeze. It is simply a rescission of the OMB memo. So that in and of itself, I think, is kind of creating some additional confusion. There are some reports out there that the funding pause has been rescinded, but that's not actually what the White House is saying. They've rescinded the memo, but they have not said they're going to rescind the pause in federal assistance spending. So I certainly think that they could have been more clear in their communication here. I think it probably would have been better to just start reviewing these programs one by one and decide what they want to cut, rather than creating this bit of chaos and saying we're going to freeze everything and then figure out what we want to unfreeze and what's going to be permanently cut. All right, so the Federal Reserve met last week and they had their press conference. This is according to RIS Media. Quote, at the Federal Reserve's first 2025 press conference on January 29th, following a two-day meeting, Fed Chair Jerome Powell announced that there would not be an immediate rate cut. The action or inaction, which was unanimously agreed upon by the Federal Open Market Committee, was not a surprise, as there is a belief that President Donald Trump's tariff, immigration, and tax policies could throw a wrench into the Fed's rate-cutting strategies if they cause more inflation. At the World Economic Forum's annual meeting last week in Davos, Donald Trump said he would demand interest rates drop immediately. While Powell said he has had no contact with the president regarding those comments, he maintained that the economy has shown resilience with GDP growth above 2% and solid labor market conditions, though inflation remains slightly above the 2% target. The FOMC's policy stance is less restrictive than before, he said, allowing flexibility to adjust based on economic developments. Activity in the housing sector seems to have stabilized in the labor market. Conditions remain solid. Payroll job gains averaged to 170,000 per month over the past 3 months, following earlier increases. The unemployment rate has stabilized since the middle of last year, and at 4.1% in December, it remains low. At the same time, Powell said he had heard anecdotally that it had, quote, suddenly gotten harder for construction industries and other businesses that depend on immigrant labor to find workers, while adding, this hasn't shown up in the data yet. Not sure why he would bother mentioning that if it hasn't shown up in the data. The committee is also conducting a 5-year review of its monetary policy framework with a focus on maintaining the 2% inflation goal. The Fed remains committed to supporting maximum employment and price stability, emphasizing the impact of their actions on communities and businesses across the country, Powell said. Asked about President Trump's comments in Davos, Powell said that, quote, "I am not going to have any response or comment whatsoever on what the president said. It's not appropriate for me to do so. The public should be confident that we will continue to do our work as we always have, focusing on using our tools to achieve our goals and really keeping our heads down and doing our work, and that is how we best serve the public." The Fed reiterated that the timing and extent of future rate cuts, language it introduced last month as it laid the groundwork for Wednesday's pause, would depend on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. Last year, with inflation slowing and the job market showing signs of a potential slowdown, officials on the FOMC slashed the benchmark financing rate by a full percentage point across 3 consecutive meetings. The rate is now in the range of 4.25% to 4.5%. Consumer borrowing costs remain the highest in over 10 years, according to data tracked by Bankrate, while the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage actually rose despite the cuts, so it is not clear how another rate cut from the Fed would affect interest and mortgage rates in the short term, unquote. So I've been saying this, over and over in the past several months. Inflation is still not under control. However, the Federal Reserve seems to have really shifted their focus from solving the inflation problem to making sure that the labor market doesn't break. That seems to be the bigger concern for them right now. So unless we see some significant weakening in the economic data, particularly the labor market data, I don't think the Fed is going to be in any kind of a hurry to continuing loosening up their policy. I don't think we're going to see rate cuts unless the unemployment rate goes up significantly. But more importantly than just the unemployment rate, we need to be looking at the initial weekly jobless claims. That tends to be a really good leading indicator. And also you look at the number of workers in the residential construction industry, that number is still growing. And typically we start to see layoffs in that segment of the labor force before we slip into a recession. So right now the data seems to show that the economy has been very resilient. And even though the unemployment rate had been trending upward, that has been relatively stable over the last 6 months or so. So one of the comments there from that article is that, there's a lot of concern about Trump's tariff policy causing inflation. And we've talked about this before in recent weeks. There's a lot of fear about that. You see a lot of headlines about Trump's tariffs are going to cause inflation. Now, that is a legitimate concern because if Trump were to enact tariffs to the extent that he's floated while on the campaign trail, that certainly could have an inflationary effect. However, I would encourage you guys to go back to episode 4 of the show, which was the first one I recorded after the election, where we really did a deep dive on some of Trump's policies and how a second Donald Trump administration was likely to impact the housing market. One of the things that I mentioned is that when you look at Donald Trump's first term in office, you could see that his actual tariff policy was a lot milder than what he had discussed on the first time around campaigning. In reality, Trump used tariffs more as leverage in negotiations. So, for example, on the first time Donald Trump was campaigning back in 2015, 2016, he had talked about a 60% tariff across the board on all Chinese imports. But in reality, he ended up doing a 25% tariff on steel, 10% tariff on aluminum, 25% tariff on certain other goods from China. And really that sparked a series of negotiations, and those tariffs ended up being lowered or delayed. You may also remember that the Trump administration announced that it was going to enact a 5% tariff against Mexico based on the illegal immigration issue at our southern border. However, just days before that tariff was scheduled to go into effect, Trump announced that he had reached a deal with the Mexican government, and that involved 6,000 Mexican National Guard troops being deployed across the country of Mexico to help stem the flow of illegal immigration from other countries up through Mexico and into the United States. And this also included the Mexican government agreeing to house migrants who were seeking asylum. This came to be known as the Remain in Mexico policy. So these are instances of Trump using tariffs as a negotiation tool to get what he wants. There's actually a very recent example of this just from last week when the president of Colombia turned away a couple flights of Colombian nationals that were being deported, being flown back on military aircraft from the United States back to their home country of Colombia. So initially, approval was given for these 2 flights, but then after the planes already took off and they were in the air heading to Colombia, the president then said he was not going to accept those flights. Now, here's what Donald Trump said in a post on Truth Social. Quote, I was just informed that 2 repatriation flights from the United States with a large number of illegal criminals were not allowed to land in Colombia. This order was given by Colombia's socialist president, Gustavo Petro, who is already very unpopular amongst his people. Petro's denial of these flights has jeopardized the national security and public safety of the United States. So I have directed my administration to immediately take the following urgent and decisive retaliatory measures. Number 1, emergency 25% tariff on all goods coming into the United States from Colombia. In 1 week, the 25% tariff will be raised to 50%. Number 2, a travel ban and immediate visa revocations on the Colombian government officials and all allies and supporters. Number 3, visa sanctions on all party members, family members, and supporters of the Colombian government. Number 4, enhanced customs and border protection inspections of all Colombian nationals and cargo on national security grounds. Number 5, IEEPA treasury, banking, and financial sanctions to be fully imposed. These measures are just the beginning. We will not allow the Colombian government to violate its legal obligations with regard to the acceptance and return of the criminals they forced into the United States, unquote. So Donald Trump was not messing around. They refused these 2 flights landing in Colombia that were, again, returning these Colombian nationals that were being deported. They were repatriation flights. The president of Colombia said, no, we're not going to accept the flights based on, I guess, how they were supposedly treating these migrants who were being returned. Donald Trump said 25% tariff, and in a week it's going up to 50%, along with all these other sanctions. And within hours, the president of Colombia completely caved and agreed to all of President Trump's terms. So whenever you're dealing with tariffs, the fear is that it's always going to escalate into a trade war. We do tariffs on their imports, and then they put tariffs on our goods, and it just escalates, and it ends up harming both parties. The way I would explain it is that a tariff trade war is kind of like a game of chicken. Now, in this particular case, it worked really well because, the metaphor of if it's a game of chicken, the United States economy is kind of like a big semi-truck. When you compare that to the economy of Colombia, it's kind of like playing chicken with a semi-truck against maybe a bicycle, okay? In this particular case, I think about 1% of our imports come from the country of Colombia, whereas from Colombia's perspective, the United States market represents about 25% of their exports. So yes, if we did a tariff, a 25%, 50% tariff on Colombian imports, that would be a minor inconvenience to American citizens. We would probably see an increase in the cost of coffee and flowers and some things like that. However, that would be absolutely detrimental to the economy of Colombia. So of course they were going to cave on something like this. Just based on the relative size of the economies and how big of an impact they are to our market and how big of an impact the United States is to their economy. Now, in other situations, this might not work as well. So tariffs with Canada, maybe some European countries, with China, you start to get to the point where our economies are closer in size, and it would have a more detrimental impact on us if those tariffs were to go into effect. So you certainly don't want to let this get out of control. You've got to be very strategic with these tariffs. It's certainly a dangerous game to play when you start using tariffs in this way. My personal opinion is that tariffs should really mostly be used as a way to protect our national security interests. For example, we should try to make sure that certain things are manufactured in the United States, like components for military equipment, things like that. However, like I said, if you look at Trump's first term, his use of tariffs is much milder than what he actually talked about on the campaign trail. And if I had to bet on it, I would say that's probably going to be the case during Trump's second administration as well. All right, so moving on, this is the latest data from pending home sales. Unfortunately, they are reversing course. So this is according to Real Estate News. After 4 months of upward momentum, pending home sales fell in December, closing out the year on a disappointing note. Mortgage rates, meanwhile, held steady. The increases in pending sales throughout the fall pointed to a possible housing market rebound in 2025, and agents were starting to express more optimism about their sales prospects in the year ahead. But much like existing home sales, which ended 2024 at the lowest level since 1995, pending sales appeared to peter out last month, falling 5.5% from November and 5% year over year, according to the latest data from the National Association of Realtors. Adding uncertainty to the outlook for the early 2025 housing market, said Bright MLS chief economist Lisa Sturdivant. Lawrence Yoon, NAR's chief economist, acknowledged that one step back is not welcome news, but also noted that economic data never moves in a straight line. So we saw 4 months in a row of growth in pending home sales. We had some really good news in the fall of 2024. However, as we got into December, it looks like that trend reversed itself, and we ended the year on a down note. All right, shifting gears, I want to talk about the rental rate growth, which has slowed considerably. This is according to Rentometer. Quote, the rental market is undergoing a noticeable shift as both apartment rents and the single-family rental market, which houses 14 million Americans and has outperformed apartment rents over the past couple years, experience a marked slowdown. According to Rentometer's latest single-family rental market report, while average rents for single-family homes have continued to rise in the U.S., reaching $2,357 in 2024, the pace of rent growth has significantly slowed. After sharp increases of 7.1% year-over-year in 2022, and then 4% year-over-year in 2023, rent growth tapered to just 0.8% year-over-year in 2024, marking the smallest annual increase in recent years, unquote. So I've got the graph that I want to put up here for you guys, and you can just see how big of a difference the rent growth rate has been over the last several years. So again, in 2022, rents were up over 7% from the year before. In 2023, rents were still up, but the rate of growth was down quite a bit, just under 4%. And then last year in 2024, it looks like rents across the country, specifically for single-family homes, was up less than 0.8%. That's 0.77%. All right, so Nakia Wright, the new CEO of the National Association of Realtors, is promising a NAR turnaround. This is according to Inman. Quote, Nakia Wright sees herself as a turnaround executive, and she argued Friday that she will succeed in saving the National Association of Realtors. She was made the organization's permanent chief last August. Wright joined the association after previously working in the newspaper world, and while NAR grappled with both a leadership scandal and sprawling antitrust litigation related to commissions. During her time on stage Friday, Wright argued that she arrived with a mandate to right the ship. No pun intended. Brad Inman went on to ask Wright about NAR's budget, the subsidiaries the organization runs, and leadership salaries. The last issue being one that has generated controversy in recent months, thanks to reports of lavish spending by and pay for these so-called volunteer leaders. Wright responded that she wants to be as transparent as possible without going over her fiduciary duty. She added that, quote, the budget of yesterday was different. The budget of today is much more constrained, as everyone knows. We will win the day by being transparent, Wright added. Brad Inman soon returned to the topic, asking if, quote, the former CEO is still getting paid a fortune. One, that is not my understanding, and two, his leaving was prior to my getting to stay at NAR, Wright said, adding a moment later, I'm not privy to that information, nor am I focused on that at all, unquote. So a couple months ago on episode 6 of the show, we talked about one of the latest scandals over at NAR, and that was thanks to an expose from the New York Times, focusing primarily on lavish spending over at the association, the gold-plated perks that they give to their executives, the large paychecks that they paid these quote-unquote volunteer leaders, and primarily the fact that these executives tend to stay on the books receiving compensation even years after they've stepped down from their official capacity because they're kept on the books as quote-unquote consultants. If you're interested, you can check that out at realestatebackstage.com/episode 6. All right, so Keller Williams is suing InsideRE over some alleged trademark infringement. This is related to its recent rebrand from KV Core to Bold Trail. According to Inman, quote, Keller Williams Realty Inc. has alleged in a lawsuit that InsideRE's new Bold Trail branding, which replaced branding for KV Core, infringes on KW's own Bold marks branding and has allowed the company to unfairly profit from KW's established brand. InsideRE informed Inman in June of 2024 that it had rebranded its KV Core real estate business software to Bold Trail, a brand name that would apply to the company's collection of applications, which includes software that supports CRMs, digital marketing and presentations, listing promotion, transaction management, and more. The move came after InsideRE acquired a number of companies in recent years, including that of Boomtown in early 2023, and faced marketing challenges as a result. The name was in part inspired by InsideRE's belief that real estate is not for the timid and that it wants to be a strong partner in tough times. In addition to using the word bold in its name, the branding of InsideRE's product also features a purple color in some iterations, which is a color that KW uses heavily in its own Bold Marks product branding. Such resemblances make InsideRE's product marketing, quote, confusingly similar to KW's marketing of a very similar product, the real estate franchise claimed. A spokesperson for Keller Williams told Inman that the lawsuit was filed, quote, to put an end to Inside Real Estate's wrongful use of our Bold trademark suite of offerings. Since 2009, KWRI Bold and Bold Leadership have been distinctive and well-known services that lead the industry in providing real estate consulting services and the real estate professional education and development services. Inside Real Estate has since copied these industry-leading offerings with the rebranding of similar products, namely Bold Academy and Bold Trail in 2024. This intentional trademark infringement has confused the marketplace, and it is a blatant attempt to capitalize on the success and goodwill of the KW brand, unquote. So I'm going to put up here on the screen for those of you watching on YouTube, you can see the Bold branding from Keller Williams and then the Bold branding from InsideRE, which again is a replacement for its prior KV Core branding. So, some similarities there. They both have the word bold. They both tend to be purple and white. I don't know how I feel about this. I guess I can understand it from Keller Williams' perspective. They put a lot of time and money into this branding, and this seems to be very, very similar, especially since they're marketing very similar product offerings. So I don't know. I'll leave that up to you guys. Go ahead and leave a comment. Let me know what you think about this particular one. Do you think KW is out of line here, or do you think they're acting well within their rights to go after InsideRE to shut down, this quote-unquote trademark infringement? All right, y'all, that is a wrap for the show today. Just a reminder, you can find the show notes with links to all the articles we reference at realestatebackstage.com/episode 16. And I'll see you here next week with another behind-the-scenes look at the real estate industry here on Real Estate Backstage.